Hello, welcome to the second module for History 451. And this week, I'm going to talk with you a little bit about industrialization and urbanization. That's our topic for this week. And I realize as we're looking at the readings this week, and you have some different pieces that you're looking at this week, I realize that for a lot of you, this is material that maybe you haven't explored or thought about since the last time you took a history course. And for a lot of you, that may mean the last time you took a history course, a U.S. history course, might have been high school, which I'm sure we have all blocked from our memories. And so this week, I actually want to do something I'm not going to generally do that often, which is to give a little bit of a contextual lecture about some specific topics related to industrialization and urbanization in the American experience, and tie that back to the development of the Bay Area. The San Francisco Bay Area develops in the form that we see it today, really beginning with the period of American occupation. And so we're really talking about, again, the end of the Spanish-American War in 1848 and the entry of California as a state in 1850. That's really the start point where we see a pretty profound redevelopment of the Bay Area, a process that takes several generations, but certainly the development of San Francisco and Oakland is exacerbated by these tendencies in the broader sort of context of late 19th century American history. Now, when we talk about this period in America and in the Bay Area, we tend to talk about these forces of industrialization and urbanization as influencing one another and as enabling one another, almost in a sort of a symbiotic relationship. And certainly, I think that's a fair assessment. But I want us to try to understand and have a sort of deeper understanding, I should say, of what these terms mean and how they impact what we're doing. So let's start with industrialization. When we use the term industrialization, generally we're talking about a process that begins really in the second half of the 19th century. There is an industrial revolution in the first half of the 19th century and in other parts of the world, even earlier than that. But this process of industrialization we tend to associate with the Second Industrial Revolution, which takes place during the so-called Gilded Age in American history, again, the second part of the 19th century. Now, this Second Industrial Revolution and this process of industrialization is typified by a few different forces. One, the rise of some different components or forms of capitalism, corporate capitalism, the idea of companies not owned by a single owner, but again, owned by a variety of different owners, people who own shares in a company. This idea of the corporation is something I think most of us are fairly familiar with today. Corporations had a competitive advantage against other kinds of businesses because they really were on a much larger scale. They had all of this investment capital, which meant that they could grow much more rapidly and outcompete privately owned businesses. And this is, again, going to cause a real kind of huge, I would say almost a sea change in American economics, right? Because private companies in a lot of ways will not ever be able to keep up, and it's going to limit competition. And that limiting of competition reaches a kind of critical breaking point. And I'll talk about that in a moment. The other sort of emergent force in capitalism is something we call managerial capitalism, and this goes hand in hand with the corporation. When you have these large corporations, you also have to have people that are sort of leading different components and different factors of this. And so the idea of the middle manager of management in general is something that is refined during this time period. Corporations are going to emerge during this era of the Second Industrial Revolution, in part because they're able to serve the needs of a variety of different customers. And I'll talk about one of the ways that that's possible and why that happens in just a moment, right? And this is in part because corporations are going to play into a growing culture of specialization. Instead of going to one place to buy all of your stuff and going to a general store, we're going to see more specialized businesses. Retail is one way, but we can think of this, but also specialized production as well. That there's enough of a marketplace to support really focused production of goods. This is important for us to think about as we think about the economic development of the Bay Area, a region that has lots of different products, including agricultural products during this era, which will become increasingly specialized during this era. So we're not going to just see before the 1850s, most of what the California economy produced, believe it or not, was what we call the hide and tallow trade. So basically stuff associated with cattle ranching, cow hides, and tallow, refined beef fat that could be used in a variety of different products. That's going to be, we're going to see massive specialization, in part as the result of growing industrialization in this part of the United States. Now, when you have these forces at play and you're starting to see less and less competition, we start to see the emergence of a real threat to free market capitalism, which is the development of monopolies. And these kinds of monopolies, again, choking out all other competition, make it almost impossible for someone to start a business in that particular industry or that particular field. And as a result, we're starting to see increasing consolidation of wealth. Fewer and fewer people have more and more of the wealth in America, and that's something that carries over to California as well. So when we think about and study this idea of inequity, inequity is not a recent problem that just was created as a result of sort of recent, like within this last generation, recent gentrification, for example, but it's actually something that has been a persistent feature of the Bay Area's economy and certainly California and America's economies over the last 150 years. Now, one of the things that I want you to be aware of is during this time period, this formative development period for the Bay Area, there's very minimal regulation or interference on the part of the government. I want to be clear. Federal and state government do intervene in the economy, but generally on the behalf of corporations and big business during this period. So again, to be clear, it's not that there's no government intervention. This is not a libertarian wonderland, but instead government intervention is by and for large-scale business. And the place where we really see this is the example of industry that I want to focus on, the one that's so instrumental in developing the Bay Area, and that's railroads. Author Frank Norris, amongst others, referred to railroads, specifically the Southern Pacific, as the octopus, this multi-tentacled being that controlled all aspects of California's economy and politics, and even influenced California's social life. And it makes sense. Railroads are, in a lot of ways, some of the best examples of these kinds of powerful, monopolistic industries that have incredible hold and incredible influence over the lives of people. California receives its really kind of its first direct connection to a transcontinental railroad in 1869, but railroads actually were being developed in the 1850s and 1860s. In fact, the earliest railroads were built in the San Francisco Bay Area as interurban railroads, rail lines like the rail line that connected San Francisco and San Jose along the peninsula. These were rail lines that actually brought raw materials, particularly agricultural goods, as well as people in and out of the city. And so when we think about railroads, they're not just these large, massive rail lines like the Transcontinental Railroad. I'll show you an image here, right? This is something we're probably familiar with. But we also are talking about short lines, smaller rail lines, and those are being developed in California as early as the 1850s. And a lot of them are being developed actually here in the Bay Area. Okay. Now, the Transcontinental Railroad was a major undertaking. Okay, it required an incredible amount of labor. Now, when we think about that labor, a lot of us reflect on this famous image, the hammering of the golden spike. Here are all these people, and we tend to look at this image, and a lot of people say, oh, these are the people that built this massive railroad that links California to the rest of the United States. And of course, the reality is in California that most of the people that built the railroad, certainly the rail line that went through the treacherous heights of the Sierra Nevadas, were actually migrant laborers from East Asia, specifically from China. And here we see an image of Chinese laborers working on the rail line. We actually don't know as much about the experience of these people as we could. Certainly, we don't know how many people died. There are lots of sort of ranges of estimates, but we're talking about thousands of laborers who were compelled, who were brought to California to build this rail line. And this is a rail line, this transcontinental line, originally only from Sacramento, eventually will be extended into Oakland and allowing access to the greater San Francisco Bay Area. This is the terminus. And this is why it's so important to understand the connection, the roots of this history, and understanding the urban form in San Francisco and in Oakland. Now, these rail lines were impressive, but they weren't just impressive because they were great feats of engineering. They were also great feats of capitalism, right? They weren't built to be profitable. In fact, most rail lines are not profitable on their own. In fact, it was very difficult to get investment. The way that this worked, the way that this could happen, okay, is through land redistribution, right? Through the breaking up of land. And this is an example of a map. This is actually from Arkansas, but it gives us an idea. Actually, if we look at this bigger map, we can see a little bit. I even have a better image of this. You know what? Let's look at that better image. Where did I put it? Oh, right here. So this is a map of government land grants. The way that these railroads were paid for is the companies would receive not only loans from the government, but free land in exchange for building the lines. Now, when we look at these land grants, it's actually along this checkerboard pattern. So it's not that solid blue, but it's plots of land alternating between the government holding onto that land and railroads taking that land. And you can see these private industries, these rail companies, were taking immense amounts of land that were claimed by the federal government. And this is the government essentially is giving over immense amounts of wealth to these private companies. And that's what I meant when I said that the federal government doesn't stay out of the economy during this era. This is not a libertarian kind of venture. In fact, the federal government has intervened in the economy for a very long time, but generally here only on behalf of industry, right? They're giving away all of this land, and this is what allows for this massive development. Now think about this, right? All of this land in places like California and the Bay Area is being given to railroad companies. Railroad companies are going to develop that land and sell it. That's how they're going to make money. But it's also going to be the sort of beginnings, the foundations of structural inequity, right? Because you have so much wealth that's consolidated in the hands of so few. Now, when we look at the Bay Area and the importance of railroads, it's really important to highlight the importance of the Southern Pacific. The Southern Pacific was completed, the route between the Bay Area and Los Angeles completed in 1876. By the beginning of the 20th century, we can see this is the Southern Pacific's map, and you can see that it connects the Bay Area with a wide range of California, including multiple lines running and coursing through the Central Valley. This is what's going to allow for urbanization, right? The sort of tapping into rural production in different parts of the state allows for the creation of these larger cities like San Francisco. Certainly, the completion of the Southern Pacific down to Los Angeles is what's going to exacerbate the growth of its population as well. So why are railroads important? They're this example of industrialization. They enable other forms of industrialization in the Bay Area and in San Francisco because it connects San Francisco to marketplaces all throughout the United States and the rest of California, right? So that's important too. But let's think about some of the impacts. One, it's going to really push the development of something we call agribusiness, right? Where we see large corporately owned farming enterprises throughout California, again, all feeding into urban areas like San Francisco. San Francisco can urbanize as a result of this and become a more densely packed city, in large part because, of course, all of this food and all these agricultural goods are being produced elsewhere. Agribusiness is actually an important part of our story, right? It's going to really rework the environment, cause us to have real kind of complicated discussions in California about water rights. And if you're interested in this, we talk a lot about this in our History of California course, right? It, again, amplifies industrial growth in places like San Francisco. We see factories sprouting up to produce a range of goods, and these are goods that are not just going to be consumed locally or regionally, but now can be exported all across the country. We're going to see a great deal of conflict as well, because, again, we see the consolidation of wealth. We have people who have, and then we also have people who do not have, an increasing dependence in factories on migrant labor in particular is going to create conflict, particularly interethnic and interracial conflict. In San Francisco, this comes to a head in the 1870s with the rise of a group called the Working Men's Party, led by a man named Dennis Kearney. This party really is based on the principle of migrant laborers, particularly from undesirable locations, specifically East Asia, losing their rights. The call here is the Chinese must go. And I want you to think about this, right? This idea of interethnic and interracial conflict and of white supremacy being linked to the development of industrialization and urbanization in places like the Bay Area. It's a really important connection to make now. This is a longer history than sometimes we tend to imagine. Finally, it's going to allow for the development of cities like San Francisco and Oakland. And these are going to be obviously a big part of our story. San Francisco is not just developed as this gold rush town, but actually a 19th century city very much based in industrial development as a result of railroads. And that industrial development is going to, of course, create a lot of challenges as well. But the city is going to grow. Now, I want to talk about cities and urbanization next, because you can see industrialization leads to urbanization, but urbanization also helps industrialization because it allows for the consolidation of labor in centralized places that make factories possible. These two developmental forces feed upon each other, and that's certainly the case in San Francisco. Urbanization was a really profound force throughout the United States, not just in the Bay Area in the second half of the 19th century. And think about it. The United States population will double between 1870 and 1900. In 30 years, our country's population would double. But the population of cities during this time period triples. So we have lots of people who are leaving the countryside and coming to live in cities. And when we think about it, when they come to live in these places, we think of places like this. Is actually not a picture of San Francisco. This is a picture of New York. Although, for whatever reason, this is Hester Street. And I think this is a picture was taken in 1904. Whenever I think about driving into the city, like on a busy weekend or during rush hour or what have you, if I'm going into downtown, this is what I imagine looking for parking looks like. This is what's going on in my head. I'm like, this is what it's going to look like when I'm looking for a parking space. Indeed, right, cities were teeming, densely packed places in the 19th century. San Francisco is no exception. Even to this day, San Francisco is a remarkably dense city. It's one of the densest cities in the United States, second only actually to New York and Manhattan. So you can think about how many people are squeezed in such a small space, 49 square miles, not a whole lot of space. You have lots and lots of people that are squeezed in there. And that was even true during this time period as it grew, right? So cities are growing out and spreading out, and San Francisco does do that in the 19th century, but it's also, San Francisco and other cities are also growing up. They're developing structures like these. These are called skyscrapers. San Francisco, unfortunately, largely due to the 1906 earthquake and fires, we don't have as many of these pre-20th century structures around, but some of them still do exist. You can see some of even the early structures from the post 1906 earthquake period are these early skyscrapers. Now think about this. You have a 15 or 20 story building. There's engineering feats that need to be really kind of challenges that need to be overcome with things like use of steel and better quality steel, but also think about just the practicality of like, you need an elevator. People are not going to climb 20 flights of stairs. So there's technology that comes into play here as well that allows these cities to grow up. People are also going to have a different experience in the city. In places like San Francisco, and San Francisco was host to a variety of these kinds of institutions. We see the development of new commerce in the form of department stores. San Francisco actually had a series of different department stores that it called its own, including places like the city of Paris. Typical department stores, some of the earliest American department stores like Macy's and Marshall Field's. Here's a picture actually from Chicago. This is Marshall Field's. These were places that were department stores, pretty easy for us to imagine, even though a lot of us do our shopping online today. These are large retail enterprises where the store is broken up into different departments or areas where you purchase different kinds of goods, right? Pretty fascinating and really important, and an important part of urban culture during this time period. Now, urban living wasn't just all shopping and enjoying the beauty of downtown San Francisco. It was also filled with problems. A lot of these problems were associated with patterns of poverty. San Francisco will develop along a pretty typical 19th century plan. Market Street forming its important sort of viaduct conduit that sort of links these different portions together or divides the different portions of the city. But San Francisco will develop really kind of fascinating neighborhoods, some very close to one another, where the wealthy will live, places like Nob Hill, where the very poor will live, in the Tenderloin and South of Market, close to the warehouses and industry. These are persistent forces in the shaping and nature of the city, right? As well as developing ethnically and racially segregated neighborhoods like Chinatown, for example. And these were places that were really kept exclusive by local and state laws. These are places that were essentially kept to certain racial groups confined. Now, a lot of the problems that people had with urban life were the arrival of new people. A lot of the people living in cities like San Francisco were coming from different parts of the world and bringing with them different cultures and different ways of seeing the world, right? When we look at this is actually a ship manifest. During this time period, we tend to focus on, in places like San Francisco, the growth in population of Southern and Eastern Europeans, as well as East Asian populations. These are groups of people that are coming to live in San Francisco that in some cases don't have a lot in common with one another, and certainly don't have a lot in common with many other Americans. And this is going to create some deep conflict in places like San Francisco. I talked about the Working Men's Party as an example of this. Now, people reacted to the rise of immigrant culture in the city in a variety of ways. Many people saw the cities as essentially slums, right, as places that were filled with poverty and disease that needed to be fixed. And I want you to think about this idea. The reaction to migrant cultures in the 1880s and 1890s are not all that dissimilar than the reactions we see with urban renewal, which we'll study later in this course in the 1950s and 1960s, and even reactions to homelessness and poverty today in the 21st century. People wanted to essentially excise these portions of the population, get rid of them, and stop them from growing. And this is kind of a movement we call nativism in general. A set of movements under this umbrella of nativism are anti-migrant or anti-foreign, xenophobic movements, people who are concerned about migrants coming from different parts of the world. A lot of these movements will do their best to diminish the humanity of these people or their rights to things like fair housing, clean water, clean air, etc. This is typified in the 1870s and 1880s by anti-migrant legislation, and anti-immigrant legislation, is, believe it or not, is very much deeply rooted in the history of the Bay Area. A lot of early local and state regulations were born here in the San Francisco Bay Area, and some of the first legislation to ever regulate immigration will actually come from representatives of the Bay Area. The best example of this is the Page Act, which is passed in 1876 by the U.S. Congress, written by Representative Page of San Mateo. This act barred migration of Chinese women to the United States. It's actually the first piece of significant legislation to regulate immigration to the U.S. in American history, only possible because of the 14th Amendment and its definition of citizenship. The Page Act is something that anticipated the later passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act, inspired in part by constitutional deliberations at the state level, the state constitution of California, at the end of the 1870s that passed resolutions to bar Chinese migration to the state. Okay, there is also a reaction of reform culture, people that are trying to help migrants, in some cases for better, and in some cases for worse. So I've talked a lot this week. I won't talk this much ever again. I'm not going to promise, but I'm pretty sure I won't. I just wanted to give you some of this broader historical context. I think it'll help not just with the readings this week, but actually for the next several weeks. In fact, I would say actually throughout this semester, we're going to be talking about some of these issues, especially in reflecting on the present day and the contemporary era. I look forward to reading your reflections. Thank you for your work thus far, and I look forward to talking to you soon.